Thanks to everyone for being here tonight. Just before the meeting, Harold said to me, about how confused the world is now. It's so confused, as a matter of fact, that it's caused a split in the Bush family. I don't know if people have read about this. I mean, a pretty blatant, a big split. You know, and it's interesting what the division is there. I don't know how long ago interviews were done with Bush where he said this by the editor, Meacham, of the book. But I do remember this, and I think it's very relevant to our discussion here tonight, that in 1991, in the first Gulf War, which was a terrible, brutal, imperialist war, destroyed the infrastructure of Iraq deliberately. Supposedly to get Iraq to leave Kuwait, they had to destroy the telephone companies and the food companies and the water and sewage and everything, you know, so Bush and Powell and Cheney, who were responsible for that war. But when the war ended, Powell and Bush, George H.W. Bush, were opposed. They didn't go to Baghdad. And there was a lot, some people here probably remember there was a lot of criticism of them. Why did you go to Baghdad and finish off? And I don't remember who said it. It might have been Powell or it might have been another representative that said, well, then we could snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Meaning that it was one thing to smash Iraq the way that they did with their superior military power, but occupying Iraq would be a very different thing. And if we look at the situation today, if we look at this very, very confused looking situation, but one which is a tragedy, a disaster for the people all over the Middle East, and particularly in Iraq and in Syria and Libya, and other countries are very affected too. I mean, there's relatively small population countries that have huge numbers of refugees. I mean, look at how the U.S. government talks about, we can't have all these people coming into the U.S. How about Lebanon, a country with like 4 million people and 1 million refugees or more from Syria? So this is a disaster, but particularly for those three countries, I would say Libya, Syria, and Iraq, a disaster of untold proportions. And what it grows out of, and what this extremely confused and confusing situation grows out of more than anything else, is the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. I don't think there's any question. I mean, and I think that's what, in the way, whatever way you put it, Bush Sr. meant about when he was calling Rumsfeld and Cheney iron asses, and you know how belligerent and they were. It's not that he really had some great sympathy for the people of the region. He proved that numerous times, and particularly in 1991. But that they led U.S. policy into not only something that was so devastating for the people there, but which has really ended an era for the U.S. in the Middle East. And I want to talk a little bit about the era, and then I want to talk and how this progression, and then talk some about the Palestinian struggle and where things are at this point. But since the end of World War II, when the United States emerged as the dominant power in the region, it has sought to dominate the Middle East as a key element, as a core element of U.S. foreign policy, a foreign policy aimed at global domination, because of its vast oil resources and also because of its strategic position as a crossroads of the world between Asia, Africa, and Europe, a key crossroads. And it's been a key crossroads for many, many centuries. But in the aftermath of World War II, and even before, there had begun to arise, particularly with the British and the French takeover and division of the area after World War I, the rise of nationalist movements, the Arab nationalist movement, which took many different forms and had many different organizational manifestations, especially after World War II. So that there were strong communist parties that existed in Iraq and in Syria, that grew in Sudan. There was an Egyptian Communist Party. There was another wing of the secular movement, was the Ba'athist Party, the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, meaning the Arab Renaissance Socialist Party, which was not communist and in fact had wings that were both communist and anti-communist. And there were all these different organizations. There was the Tudeh Party, which was the Communist Party in Iran, and other nationalist forces, like the ones that led the Algerian Revolution, which took the lives of 1 million Algerians before it triumphed in 1962. All of these movements, the U.S. was out to destroy. And all of the secular, progressive, revolutionary, communist, socialist, all those movements and governments that came into being, the U.S. aim was to destroy them. One thing we could go back a little bit further than what happened in 2001 was the destruction, the biggest CIA operation in history up until that time, which was in 1979 in Afghanistan, when the U.S. went in and under Carter 6 months before the Soviet intervention, and on the side of forces that had risen up, and the armed resistance. There had been a revolution in Afghanistan in April of 1978, and then the next year there was a rebellion based on opposition to girls being educated. And I forget the name of if it was in Herat or another city, but that's where it began. And the U.S. saw, and Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote, spoke about this 20 years later when he told a French newspaper, yeah, we did it. That's what we did. We wanted to give the Soviets their Vietnam, and I told Carter we could do that. And Carter signed off on the order for the CIA to do that. And that gave birth to the Mujahideen, who Ronald Reagan called the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers. It was either them or the Contras. But anyways, it's one of the few things I agree with Reagan about. The Founding Fathers being what they really were. But that led to the beginning, to the birth of Al-Qaeda, but it really goes back. If we look at the history, in 1947 there was the Truman Doctrine, and the Truman Doctrine said that the U.S. was going to intervene to prevent communism from coming to power in Greece or Turkey. And at that time, the Truman Doctrine ended up resulting in sending huge amounts of military aid to an extremely right-wing and reactionary Greek government, and also to building up Turkey. In 1948, of course, was the critical support of the United States for the establishment of the State of Israel. It was the U.S. support, even though that support would be kind of mixed in the years that followed, it was critical, and Israel was established as really a base, and a base of support for Western imperialism. The first coup that the CIA was founded in 1947, its first coup was in Syria, which is little known. It's usually people think of Iran, but in 1949 there was a coup that the CIA, its first one. 1953 was the coup in Iran that overthrew the first democratically elected government, the Mossadegh government, and put in place a regime that would murder 100,000 Iranians over the next 25 years under an extremely brutal secret police, the Savak regime. And in 1958, the day after the revolution in Iraq, which finally threw off British control and brought in a coalition of communist and nationalist forces as the new leadership, the Eisenhower Doctrine was implemented, which had been announced the year before, and 20,000 Marines began landing in Lebanon, because at that point, the U.S. and the British thought, this is it for us in the Middle East. We're going to get kicked out unless we do something. And the British sent paratroopers into Jordan the next day. That was 1958. In 1963, the CIA assisted the right wing of the Ba'ath Party in overthrowing and massacring the Communist Party of Iraq, from which it never really recovered. In 1967, Israel launched its war. It was a preemptive attack another term for that is sneak attack, although that's not applied to Israel because that's reserved for somebody who attacks the United States. But they launched the preempt, and that was at a time when in the West they were calling Syria the Cuba of the Middle East. And the Syrian, Egyptian, Jordanian air forces, and particularly Syrian and Egyptian military, were decimated by this. And following that came the Nixon Doctrine 2 years later in 1969. And the Nixon Doctrine said Israel and Iran are going to become the pivots for control of the Middle East, for our control, for our domination of the Middle East. And we're going to give them a lot of money and a lot of arms. And that's when the billions of dollars of weapons began flowing to Israel. Not quite that much, but a lot to Iran as well. And why did they enact the Nixon Doctrine? Because the U.S. was a little tied down somewhere else in the world at the time. They had 550,000 troops in Vietnam. And everyone was saying, why are we so tied down in Vietnam when this is so much more important? How can we solve the problem? The Nixon Doctrine. In 1969, the U.S. supported the coup in Sudan, which smashed the Communist Party, which was a strong party in Sudan. In 1970, there was the massacre of the Palestinians in what is known as Black September, where the U.S. and Israel blocked Syria from intervening to support the Palestinians. 15,000 massacred in that. The U.S. and Israel, of course, supported the fascists in Lebanon in the Civil War in the mid-1970s. In response to the Iranian Revolution, a very key thing that happened, which isn't often focused on, is the Carter Doctrine. And what was the Carter Doctrine? The Carter Doctrine was the establishment of the Rapid Deployment Force, the RDF, and the pre-positioning of immense quantities of military supplies all over the region, which made it possible then in 1990 for the U.S. to move very quickly into to prepare for the 1991 war against Iraq and the smashing of Iraq. The U.S., of course, the Reagan administration supported the Israeli invasion, which destroyed so much of Lebanon in 1982. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, which had an alliance, and Gorbachev actually betrayed that alliance with Iraq, a mutual defense, that opened the door for the U.S. to wage the war against Iraq. It was only this concession after concession after concession that the Gorbachev government was making that opened the door for that. And then the sanctions were kept in place, several attempts to overthrow the government, CIA coups, but the sanctions so decimated Iraq. Some of us here went to Iraq during that time and saw the utter devastation of what had been a modernizing and advancing country and its reduction to the lowest, just about the lowest levels. But the big development, as I was saying at the beginning, was the decision to invade and occupy Iraq. Although Iraq, there was no reason for it really. There wasn't even an ostensible reason. Iraq wasn't doing anything. Iraq was trying to survive. At that time, its military power was probably 15% in 2003, at the most, of what it had been in 1991 when it had been crushed in 6 weeks. So there was no reason, and they all knew that it was all lies. It wasn't bad intelligence, it was falsified intelligence. The British intelligence, head of British intelligence wrote a letter, the famous, what's it called, Downing Street memo, that said, the Americans, and this was in the summer of 2002 when they decided that they were going to go, said the Americans are fixing the intelligence around the objective. Those are the exact words, and we know what that meant. But that really represented the grand overreaching that happens to almost every empire, I think, maybe every empire, where those in power believe that they are in power forever. And people were writing after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were books like Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. That's it. It's all over. Everyone's got it. This is the best it's going to get. If a third of the population of the world doesn't have enough to eat, and then some other people have as much wealth as 150 million people, that's it. You just got to accept it. And of course, that wasn't it. But there was that sense that, you know, it was only 3 months after the fall of the Soviet Union, which was December 25th of 1991, that a memo appeared, was leaked to the New York Times, and it said, you know, we have our strategy now with the Soviet Union out of the way is to make sure no power can rise to challenge us. And it expresses this extreme arrogance, and it was supervised in the Defense Department by Paul Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby. Remember those names? They were architects of the Gulf War too, and it was actually written by drafted by Zalmay Khalilzad, who was formerly the ambassador to Afghanistan and to Iraq, and these were all part of the neocon inner group. And they had this confidence, they could do it. They could do whatever they wanted to do. They could reshape, they could make Iraq look completely different, and that would mean they could reshape the whole Middle East in their image. I remember in July of 2003, just a few months after the invasion, they designed a new flag for Iraq. And the flag was white with blue and yellow. And the yellow was supposed to be rivers. And the first thing people said when they saw the flag was, wow, that looks like the Israeli flag. That flag lasted 1 day, and it was never heard of again. But this was their attitude, that they could actually do these things, to take away, you know, to de-Arabize Iraq, which I think to a large degree they really tried to do. People aren't Iraqis, and, you know, after that they were described here only as Sunni or Shia or Kurd, occasionally Turkoman. But that led to the occupation. The occupation quickly, you know, Bush came out on May 1st of 2003 and went, you know, landed on the aircraft carrier sitting in the back of the jet plane. They told him, you can take your flight suit off now. And he said, no, I think I'd rather keep it on. He liked the way it looked for the media, and announced that all major combat operations were over. Of course, the major combat operations were just starting. I remember that the foreign minister of Syria said at the time, the Americans have no idea what they're doing. Behind every corner, they'll find a knife. And that turned out to be exactly true. And anybody who had studied the history of Iraq since the time of British colonialism, there was never a year without a rebellion. It's like every single year, somewhere in some part of Iraq, bigger or smaller rebellions. That the idea that the Iraqis would accept occupation. And in their stunning arrogance, they disbanded the government, they disbanded all the ministries, they disbanded the army, they disbanded the police, and they all went home with their guns. You know, I mean, under conditions of occupation, with soldiers knocking down people's doors at night. And I mean, you know, we know what happened then. And from 2003 to 2007, it got worse and worse and worse, and it looked like the U.S. could be defeated. It could suffer an outright defeat. And the only thing that changed that was that they were able to make an alliance with part of the forces that were fighting them, who were not Al-Qaeda, and who turned against Al-Qaeda. Maybe some of them had been. But for those of us who had a chance to go to Iraq, you know, most of the population of Iraq, or at least a very large part of it, had no interest whatsoever in living under an Al-Qaeda regime, or with the rules of life as devised by Al-Qaeda or ISIS. You know, these extremely strict social rules. That was not. So a large part of the population revolted, and the U.S. paid them. 100,000 fighters switched sides. And they knew where Al-Qaeda was. They knew who Al-Qaeda was, and they defeated Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda was reduced to a very small organization with very, very little in the way of military actions by 2009, 2010. But what brought them back was, first, the U.S.-NATO invasion of Libya that tore Libya apart. And then the war in Syria and the intervention in Syria. And taking advantage of that, what had been Al-Qaeda in Iraq moved its main base into the eastern part of Syria, where the government no longer had control, built up its forces, got a lot of support from outside, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, others, and transformed itself into, then changed its name to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. And that's really what happened. That's how that took place. And it drew in people from all over who wanted to fight against the West, who were angry, but who were willing to accept the reactionary social program, the very reactionary social program of ISIS. And this is really the reality of what brought about the current situation, that is one that is so hard to understand, so hard to figure out. And in 2014, that ISIS seized a very large part and controls probably a third of the territory, of the inhabitable territory of Iraq and Syria. A large part of Syria is not inhabitable. The great Syrian desert is not inhabitable, and that's a large part of the country. So we have that situation, and the Syrian government had been losing ground. It had stabilized at the beginning. People may remember there were all these predictions. They were not going to last. They were going to be gone in no time, the Assad government, the Ba'athist government. But after a couple of years, it regained strength, and then it started more and more outside intervention coming in and just getting worn down. And in September, the Russian government intervened, and Iran intervened in a bigger way, along with Hezbollah. So now there's a very uncertain struggle that's raging there. And, but it is really, really a tragedy for the people of the region. A terrible, terrible tragedy was happening. I had the privilege of visiting Syria a couple of times, the last time in 2005. I knew in 2005 when I went there, I went for a conference on the treatment of Palestinians, refugees in different countries, how they, rights and responsibilities and so forth. But when I was there, this was about 11 months after Rafiq Hariri, who had been a former prime minister and billionaire and richest man in Lebanon, had been killed in a bomb. And there was an investigation going on. And I got there, and the long trip, and I woke up in the morning, on a Sunday morning, and it was the day before the UN was supposed to come out with a report about what happened to Rafiq Hariri. And another Lebanese right-wing politician was blown up that day. And the U.S. immediately said, Syria did it. I mean, why under any... I actually went to, communicated with through the host of the conference and said, if you want a U.S. anti-war activist to have a press conference and say why he thinks it's ridiculous that this accusation, how this made no sense at all. So I had this press conference, and all this media came from the Middle East. There was one reporter who rushed in halfway through from NPR, who ran up to me afterwards and said, what are you doing here? So I told him. I don't think they ever did anything with the story. But I mean, the point was not my press conference. The point was you could see at that point that they were going for them, right? This was in December 2005. In the WikiLeaks files that have come out, and there's a WikiLeaks book that has a chapter on Syria, they say that from the cables they have, they can see very clearly that the U.S. is going after the Syrian government since 2006. But I think it was actually earlier. And this despite the fact that the Syrian government had an inconsistent policy, and at times had supported the U.S. But the problem with that is that that wasn't good enough in this period. It wasn't good enough to sometimes work with the U.S. or be reasonable with the U.S. The problem with the U.S. government was that they were still an independent country. They weren't fouled, they weren't towing the line. So I just want to say that about the background, and I want to say talk a little bit about, as I said, the situation in Palestine, and what is behind the intensification of the struggle in Palestine over the past several weeks. And also, I think I want to just comment on there's a question everyone is asking, which I'm not sure is terribly relevant, but is it the third Intifada? And the day in and day out repression that goes on of the Palestinians is something that generates very little to zero interest among the media here or the corporate politicians. If what is happening to the Palestinians on a regular daily basis, you can pick almost any day. If that was happening on one day in Venezuela or in Cuba or in Iran, it would be front page news in the United States. And it would be on all the cable channels and everything. For the mainstream media here, the story begins And this is, if you check it out, this is always, it's when a rocket is fired from Gaza, or if an Israeli is attacked. That's the beginning of the story. There's no backstory. And this is how it's repeated over and over and over again. I mean, for people who know something, they know there's a backstory, but the way it's treated, every single, that's what constitutes violence in the eyes of the media. And all these words are used very selectively. You know, like the word gunman is a word that doesn't really mean a man with a gun. It means someone with a man with a gun we don't like. You know, U.S. soldiers I never call gunmen, although they're all running around with guns. And it's the same way with a lot of wording. That, in fact, every attack on a settler or an Israeli soldier over the last 6 weeks has been the story. That's when the headline is. There's no headline otherwise. If that's the headline, you can read through the story, and maybe somewhere you find out there were some Palestinian casualties as well. But I want to just, that's the U.S. media, of course. If you take the, just one day in headlines from the Middle East, from Middle East news sources, I just want to read a few of them. October 30th, and they're all on October 30th, actually. Israeli forces run over youth, assault journalists in Al-Bir clashes. That's Palestinian journalists. Al-Bir is the sister city of Ramallah, which is the administrative capital of the Palestinians. Same day, Israeli soldiers tell Palestinians, "We will gas you until you die," until in the Aida refugee camp. And it says that the commander of this unit went through the Aida refugee camp near Bethlehem, and on a loudspeaker said, quote, "Inhabitants of Aida, we are the Israeli occupation forces." At least they gave themselves the right name now. "If you throw stones, we will hit you with gas until you die. The children, the youth, the old people, all of you, we won't spare any of you." October 30th, same day, 8-month-old baby dies from tear gas inhalation in Al-Fajr village near Bethlehem, near where this refugee camp is. Same day, 46 injured by Israeli forces in Gaza demonstrations, 17 by live fire. Same day, Israeli forces injure 55 Palestinians, 16 by live fire in the West Bank. And it just goes on and on. This is one day. These are one day of headlines, and it's not all the headlines from that day. And while as Iman mentioned, 9 Israelis have been killed in the month of October in attacks, and dozens were injured, and there are more than 70 Palestinians by the end of the month who have been killed. And there was a report just released 2 days ago by the Palestinian Red Crescent, which is the Red Cross, the equivalent connected to the International Committee of the Red Cross, but in the Muslim world, reported that in the month of October, 2,617 Palestinians were wounded, were shot, either by live ammunition or by plastic-coated steel bullets, which they like to call rubber bullets to make the things that, which can also kill you if they hit you in it, or cause great damage. Imagine 2,617 in the month of October. I mean, that's not in the mainstream media here at all. And more than 1,000 were detained, additional detained prisoners, beaten, imprisoned, and underlying the colonial character of the relationship between the Israeli state and the Palestinians, there are now more than 6,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. There are 0 Israelis in Palestinian jails. I mean, that one fact alone tells you a lot about the relationship. On October 28th, the Amnesty International had a report that said the Israeli forces have ripped up the rule book. And that's very interesting because Amnesty International isn't partial to the Palestinians at all. But what do they mean by ripped up the rule book? I think what it means is that is illustrated by the 2,617 who were shot in the 1 month. That there's kind of like complete impunity now. The Israeli soldiers, not that they had much in the way of limits before, but it seems like there's none. And another thing that they've been doing is after they shoot a Palestinian and they're lying there in the street, they prevent them from getting medical care until they bleed out, until they die. This has happened over and over and over again in the recent period. There's a question of, as I said before, is it the third Intifada? It's hard to define that. It's hard to really know. There's certainly a great upsurge in the struggle because of the day in, day out oppression and repression that the Palestinians faced. But I would say this, that in the first Intifada, it's called the first Intifada, it wasn't really the first. Intifada means shaking off, but it's come to mean uprising. So in the 1987 to 91 uprising, Intifada, it was triggered by an event. It was a tank carrier hit a vehicle in Gaza and killed several Palestinian workers. But the stage had been set for it, and very quickly a leadership was formed of the different, what are called factions, are referred to as factions in Palestine, but are really parties. The Fatah Party, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front, the Palestine People's Party, and others at that time formed what was called the National Unified Leadership. And the National Unified Leadership worked together, bringing together the different organizations despite their different viewpoints. And they would put out a leaflet on one day and say, general strike, shut down all the stores. The store owners would shut them down. The Israeli troops would come and force them to open. As soon as they were gone, they'd shut them down again. Another leaflet would say, on another day, everyone do this, carry out this kind of a protest. So there was that kind of an infrastructure that enabled that uprising to continue. And the Israelis constantly hunted down, arrested, beat, tortured the leaders, but the leaders would constantly be replaced by others who came from the organizations. In the second Intifada, as it's called, that lasted from about 2000 to 2004, it was triggered by an event too, which was Ariel Sharon visited the Al-Aqsa Mosque, surrounded by 3,000 police. And people fought back. But at that time also, the Fatah organization formed the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which was a major fighting force against. And Hamas had come on the scene, and they were organizing the PFLP, which was by then smaller but still significant. All the forces joined together, but not quite in the same way as in the previous one. Now the question is there really the organizational infrastructure? The Popular Front, one of the leaders of the Popular Front, has called for the creation of a national unified leadership. I don't think it quite exists yet. So it's a question. It doesn't mean that it's not the beginning of the Third Intifada. It very well may be. But there's that element, there's an important element of, almost nothing can sustain itself as spontaneous. There was an illusion, I think, among Occupy. We have no leaders. We don't need any leaders. Well, that doesn't work out. That doesn't really work in practice. There has to be organizational structure in order to sustain a struggle. That's why, and I say that criticism of Occupy, even though we participated in Occupy, we support Occupy, but why we're also working on building organization. I want to refer a little bit to a little of the history, but I will be brief about it. There were two main wings of Zionism before the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and in the 1920s and 30s. One was headed by David Ben-Gurion, who was described as a labor Zionist, claimed to be a socialist, and he would become the first prime minister. And the other wing was Victor Jabotinsky, the leader of what was called the revisionists. And Jabotinsky, the main difference between them, I would maintain, was really more how they talk in public, outside their own circles. Jabotinsky wrote this. He wrote two articles, famous articles called The Iron Wall. And a few years ago, maybe 12 years ago, an Israeli historian named Avi Klein wrote a book called The Iron Wall based on what had happened with this doctrine that he put forward. And this is what he said. This is in 1923. Settlement can thus develop under the protection of a force that is not dependent on the local population, behind an iron wall, which they will be powerless to break down. A voluntary agreement is just not possible. As long as the Arabs preserve a gleam of hope that they will succeed in getting rid of us, nothing in the world can cause them to relinquish this hope, precisely because they are not a rebel but a living people, and a living people will be ready to yield on such fateful issues only when they've given up all hope of getting rid of the alien settlers with A and S capitalized. So, I mean, the self-definition of them as colonial settlers. And he said that the Arabs loved their country as much as the Jews did instinctively. They understood Zionist aspirations very well, and their decision to resist them was only natural. There was no misunderstanding between Jew and Arab, but a natural conflict. And he doesn't really mean Jew and Arab here. It really means Zionist, because there are a lot of Jewish people who are not Zionists. No agreement was possible with the Palestinian Arab. They would accept Zionism only when they found themselves up against an iron wall, when they realized they had no alternative but to accept Jewish settlement. And then he goes on to show his real contempt, which is, we Jews are Europeans. What do we have in common with the Orient? And everything that is Oriental is doomed. So speaking of what they considered the East at that time. And the Ben-Gurion side was kind of saying, you really shouldn't be saying this stuff out loud like that. And Jabotinsky was very blatant. I mean, he was an admirer of Italian fascism. There's a famous picture of him in an Italian officer's uniform in the Mussolini period. So that's who he was. And Ben-Gurion, though a few years later, in the late 1930s, wrote, "In our political argument abroad, we minimize Arab opposition to us, but let us not ignore the truth among ourselves. A people which fights against the usurpation of its land will not tire so easily." That's it. The usurpation of the land, okay? That's not how it's presented today, is it? It's like, the God-given homeland, or something like that. And he says, when we say that the Arabs are the aggressors and we defend ourselves, that is only half the truth. As regards our security and life, we defend ourselves. But the fighting is only one aspect of the conflict, which is in its essence a political one. And politically, we are the aggressors and they defend themselves. And a couple of years later, in 1940, and this is again still 8 years before the creation of the State of Israel, Joseph Weitz, who was one of the top leaders along with Ben-Gurion, and he was with Ben-Gurion and the director of the Jewish National Land Fund, which is responsible for getting land. He says, among ourselves it must be clear that there's no room for both people in this country, and there's no way, besides transferring the Arabs from here to neighboring countries, to transfer them all, except maybe for Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Old Jerusalem. We must not leave a single village, a single tribe. So this is the moderate wing, the labor Zionist, socialist, so-called wing. And among the disciples of Jabotinsky and members of his fascistic party, which was called A.N.S.W.E.R, were former Israeli prime ministers, Menachem Begin, they were actually at that time future Israeli prime ministers, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, who were leaders of the Lehi and the Irgun, two self-proclaimed terrorist organizations. Another prominent member of the party was a man named Ben-Zion Netanyahu. You might recognize that last name. Who's the father of the present prime minister. Beitar, which was the party when Jabotinsky was alive, became, after the formation of the State of Israel, the Herut party. And the Herut party, which was considered at the beginning a marginal party, I think it had 8 out of 120 seats in the parliament, later evolved into the Likud party, which is today headed by Netanyahu the son, whose real views are no different than his father's nor Jabotinsky's. So that's something that history is not drawn out at all. And when push came to shove, that is, after the illegal partition of Palestine in 1947, on November 29, 1947, illegal because there was no consultation with the people. They just, they sat in New York and the U.S. twisted arms and got a vote for the State of Israel through. And the partition happened. And then fighting broke out right away because by then the Zionists had about 6% of the land that they had bought from big landlords and so forth. But they were given 55% of the British colony of Palestine, Mandate of Palestine. and the Palestinians fought against it. The Palestinians were in a very weakened state because they'd had a big uprising from 1936 to 39 and had been defeated after a long struggle and disarmed and so forth. But at the beginning of the war kind of raged back and forth, and the Zionists had superior military equipment and training and all of that, and they'd been in World War II on the side of the British, and so they had an advantage, but they didn't have a decisive advantage. And they weren't accomplishing, by February they had a meeting of their high command, and this was headed by Ben-Gurion now, not with the Jabotinsky forces, who would have been all for the plan if they knew what the plan, had known what the plan was, and I think they probably did very quickly. But they said, look, when we have a battle, we have a battle and the people flee, but they only flee over 2 villages. They're still there. So they implemented something called Plan Dalet. Dalet being the 4th letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And Plan Dalet was a plan for terror. It was a plan. Ilan Pappé, a renowned Israeli historian, has documented more than 200 massacres that were carried out. Not just the massacre of Deir Yassin, but 200 massacres. And very typically what would happen would be that the troops, the Israeli troops, Zionist troops before Israel was formed, the Haganah, in either case, would come to a village, they would tell the population, they would separate the men and fighting age boys, shoot them, or shoot some of them, tell everybody else you have to get in this truck, and they would be driven to the Lebanese border, or to the Jordanian border, or the Egyptian border, and dumped out, mostly the Lebanese and the Jordanian or Syrian borders, and dumped out and told don't come back, or that'll be your fate too. And this process is what drove out between around 780 to 800,000 Palestinians were driven out, in keeping with what Joseph Weitz had predicted. 120,000 Palestinians were left inside what became the state of Israel. The West Bank became part of Jordan for a period of time, and Gaza became part of Egypt for a period of time. In our book, we reprinted a famous and a great pamphlet from 1969 by the outstanding Egyptian historian Abdel Wahab al-Masiri. And he quoted, to show the real viewpoint of how the Israeli leaders really saw who was around them, and the Arabs and so forth. And Abba Eban, who was one of the top leaders, wrote his biography or memoir, Voice of Israel, in 1957, and he said, the idea should not be one of integration. Quite the contrary, integration is rather something to be avoided. One of the great apprehensions which afflict us when we contemplate our cultural scene is the danger lest the predominance of immigrants of Oriental origin force Israel to equalize its cultural level with that of the neighboring world. So far from regarding our immigrants from Oriental countries as a bridge toward our integration with the Arabic-speaking world, our object should be to infuse them with Occidental, that's Western, spirit, rather than to allow them to draw us into an unnatural Orientalism. And he's talking about the Jewish people from Morocco and Iraq who are emigrating to Israel. I mean, so I say this to show how extreme. He was a moderate. Abi Ibn is one of the great moderates of Israel. But there was no real difference. And they were all really united in viewing what they saw as an irreconcilable conflict that could only be reconciled, could only be solved by the expulsion, the elimination of the Palestinian people from Palestine. And today, there's one other thing I want to that I thought was really amusing and telling about in Abdel Wahab al-Masiri's. He recounts how he was living in the U.S. and he was at Rutgers University, and he tells a member of the Mapam party. The Mapam was labor, right? Mapam was labor party in Israel, and so it was the governing party. But the guy was a pacifist and a liberal and for labor and maybe for socialism even. And Moshe Dayan, who was then in 1960, I think this is 1967 or 68, Moshe Dayan went and had this big tour in Vietnam with the U.S. and it was all go, go, go. And Masiri says to the student, talks to them about the attitude of their party. He's supposedly a pacifist and all this, and to the war, supporting the war in Vietnam, and the student's response is, Israel has to defend itself. Think about that one for a second. Against the Vietnamese? The Vietnamese are coming for the Israelis? No, but in a way he's right. In a way he's right, because really the truth of the matter is that Israel was part of the system of Western imperialism and of the U.S. imperialist system in reality. And that's really core to understanding why there is this conflict. And when you say irreconcilable conflict, there's an irreconcilable conflict between workers and capitalists. There's one between landlords and tenants. They have fundamentally divergent interests, and they're not going to be reconciled. You can tell, let's come together, let's, pray together, dance together, sing together, whatever. That contradiction does not go away. And the contradiction between Zionism and the Palestinian liberation movement also does not go away, no matter how many times people counsel the Palestinians to find the path of peace or something like that, or, let's find that magical moment. That's why, time after time after time, the negotiations don't work. But a conflict being irreconcilable doesn't mean it's unsolvable. It means it's unsolvable within the present structure. The conflict between capitalists and workers cannot be resolved under the system of capitalism. It requires a new system. It requires a socialist system. The same thing with landlord and tenant. It changes things. That under our system, the rights of private property are supreme. They tower over the rights of the people. The rights of the people are nothing compared to the rights of property, unless people really fight to enforce some rights. But like today in San Francisco, where there's this wild building boom and rents are going through the roof and everything, there's 40% of all the new luxury housing units are unoccupied. They're investments by people who have money. And they're hoping that they'll keep increasing in value and so forth. And meanwhile, there's more and more people living in the streets. That's the reality of the conflict, of what the conflict, and no one can do anything about it within the context. I mean, it's not you can't do anything, but you can't resolve it in the context of the system that exists. I don't think that the conflict, the struggle in Palestine can be resolved under the present existing structure. The Palestinians have not gone away. They were supposed to go away. When all the refugees were driven out, UN said they had to be allowed to return and get their property back, and none of that has ever happened, not even with one Palestinian. Now there's 7 million of them. And many of them are stuck in camps. They're still stuck in refugee camps. If there was even an agreement signed for a two-state solution, which would be really, the Palestinian state would be a so-called state, because it would be broken up pieces of territory under Israeli domination. But even if that happened and the leaders of the PLO or the Palestinian Authority said, okay, we give up the right of return, they can't really give up the right of return. It belongs to the people who have been expelled under law, under international law. But where would they be if that was the solution, that you can't return? What happens to all the people? And 80% of the Palestinians who are refugees today, amounting to about 7 million, those who were expelled and those who, their descendants, live within 2 hours of Palestine. It's not that there's no room. The Palestinian demographer, Salman Dr. Salman Abu Sita, has proved that that's not the issue either. There's huge parts of Palestine where they just destroyed the villages, and it's unoccupied land. So that's been thrown around as a reason why no one should even think about that. But it's very hard to tell people who have had everything stolen from them. Well, and you can see the thief right out in the open there, living on your property and so forth. Oh, just, it's okay, just forget it, it's too late now. That doesn't go over very well with people. So I think that there has to be, as long as Israel exists as the Zionist state and fails in what its real goal is, which is to force the Palestinians, the rest of the Palestinian population, or most of it out, the struggle is going to continue. And the Palestinian struggle, because it's faced so much, it's faced odds that seem impossible to to believe. I mean, it's not just Zion, the Zionist state of Israel, so this hyper-militarized state, but behind it is U.S. imperialism, and allied with it are the reactionary Arab regimes. And that's what the Palestinian movement, when it was in its revolutionary stage, and some elements of it still point out today. Saudi Arabia is much closer to the government of Israel and the United States than it is to the Palestinian cause. They can pretend somewhat differently, but there was just some embarrassing stuff about them that came out. So, given all that, the struggle that the Palestinians have waged is truly a heroic struggle. You can't put it any other way. They've been counted out over and over and over again, and they keep fighting. And as long as they keep fighting, people who stand for justice around the world should keep fighting with them. And that's why it's important, the demonstrations in Washington. Netanyahu is going to be there again for his, one more trip. No leader comes to the White House more often than the Israeli leaders. They spend more time in the Lincoln bedroom than anybody else in the world. But we'll be out there in D.C., and you'll be out here at the consulate on Monday. Thank you.